Finally, I want to tell you about the later Gothic. And the later Gothic is really defined by its extravagance. So I had brought up before that when you think about style, right, style is often defined by something starting out very simple and then over time becoming more complicated. So hopefully you notice that here at Rheims Cathedral. Go back and look at chart, right, and then look at Rheims and you'll notice that they are very different from one another, but still the same basic building blocks, right? But at REMS, you see everything being kind of pushed to its craziest conclusion, right? Everything is being sort of complicated, right, as much as possible. You have those extremely pointy arches, for instance, and you have lots of crenulation. Now, what's the crenulation? It's that kind of beading effect you see. These little dots or these little beads kind of everywhere on everything. I always compare later Gothic to kind of like a overdone wedding cake. If you've ever gone to a wedding and you've seen like kind of this crazy cake with like way too much icing and way too many roses, and it's like, could it be more elaborate? That to me is later Gothic, right? Everything is sort of pushed to its ultimate sort of expression. And so, again, there's similarities that you can see between early and later, but to me, you see that progression of style. You see how style becomes more complicated. Notice that, these churches are still getting more and more vertical, taller and taller, more and more elaborate. And so that is something to keep in mind when you look at the style here. One of the main things I love showing you at Rheims Cathedral is the jam sculpture. And the reason why I like showing it to you is because you can see the difference from looking again at Chartres jam sculpture and then looking here at Rheims. Notice right away that we're looking at more realism. So as the Gothic went on, artists started to revive, right? Techniques that had been lost. We're not fully into the Proto Renaissance yet, so we don't see, a lot of this happening in mass, right? But we do see these little glimmers, right, of Gothic artists kind of going, how can I make this figure look more lifelike, right? How can I make this imagery work, right, and look like it's more realistic? Now, why I show you these jam sculptures as well is because if you look at the two on the left and then look at the two on the right, you'll notice that there's even a kind of progression in realism between those two sets from left to right. The two on the left are earlier, they were made by an earlier artist. And then the two on the right came later. So you'll notice the ones on the left still kind of look kind of stiff and clunky a bit, but the ones on the right, you're like, oh, okay, I can see where this is going, how this is progressing. And by the way, if you're interested in the subject matter here, on the left, it's the Annunciation. It's the angel speaking to Mary and saying, you will bear God. And then on the right, you have the Visitation. The Visitation is the one I always focus on more prominently because, again, it's the one with more realism. So, again, you can think about how these are still jam sculptures, but they're becoming almost like 3D freestanding sculptures. They're not functioning like pieces of the architecture anymore. And definitely, you're starting to see contrapposto at play underneath those garments. So you're like, this is getting interesting, right? We're seeing some progression towards something that we saw in the classical and the Greco-Roman period. And the Renaissance, of course, is going to be the revival of those techniques. So stay tuned, right? Also, want to show you Sainte Chapelle, which literally just means like the chapel, right? The Saint's Chapel, right? um, and Sainte Chapelle is unique because it actually wasn't meant to be a church in the sense of a gathering space for all people. It was meant to be a small chapel, a private chapel for the King of France. So it is unique in that usage. And it actually was constructed only for the king's family and to hold these holy relics that only he would have access to, right? So it was meant to be just for the king, just for his family. Now, the underneath or the bottom part of Sainte Chapelle was the servants' chapel. So it was where the servants could come and worship. So you'll notice in the rib groin vaults, right, you have the blue of France and the fleur de lis patterning. Today, this is the gift shop, by the way. This is where you get your postcards and stuff if you went to Sainte Chapelle today. But this was the underneath portion. And then upstairs, of course, was the main chapel itself. And again, this was only accessible to the king. This is King Louis IX, who was called Louis the Pious. because he was very Catholic and very Christian and very devout. So he was Louis the Pious, very pious man. And the story here with the chapel and the relics is a pretty cool one. Louis the Ninth, Louis the Pious, right? He had heard about these relics related to Christ's Passion or the crucifixion that were located in Constantinople, and they were up for sale. And he felt it was God's will for him to send emissaries there to buy these relics and bring them back. Why he wanted to buy them is, of course, so people could venerate them there, but also Constantinople at this time was under Islamic control. So he also felt that he was saving these things from the Muslim hordes, let us say, using his attitude of the time, not mine, right? But he wanted to save these from Muslim hands, right, and bring them back, right, to France. The story is that the relics actually cost more to buy, to procure, than the entire budget to build the chapel. So that the chapel, as beautiful as it is, as you see it here, right, costs less than the actual relics did. So this was a man who spent a lot of money on his faith, right? So he bought these relics and he brought them back. The relics included the crown of thorns and a piece of the true cross, and also part of the spear that was used to spear Christ's side. They were kept here in the chapel, and he and his family could venerate them or worship them. Today, they're actually kept in Notre Dame, which is across the way on the Ile de Cité, or the island of the city, as they call it. So, actually, they are kept in Notre Dame. During the fire, many people were their main concern were the relics, but the relics actually survived the fire. So, again, another miracle, right, as far as relics were concerned. So today they're not in Saint Chapelle, they're actually in Notre Dame and very rarely put on display. And there's a huge line when they're on display, obviously, because they're very rarely shown to the public any longer. So the chapel was built to house these relics. It uses a very interesting later Gothic style, which we call rayonnette. And rayonnette is defined by the use of stained glass almost entirely to make the walls. So if you look at the walls of the chapel, you'll notice they're almost entirely made of glass, right? So it creates this jewel box effect, I always say. It has this, you go in Saint Chapelle and you just have these rays of color, right, coming through the structure and bouncing around in the structure. And it's just this beautiful kaleidoscope in a sense that you're standing inside. So it's just amazing, right, to be in there. So it's very unique architecture. During World War II, they actually had to take all the glass out because of the bombing raids to make sure this building was protected, and then the glass was reinserted right after the end of the war. So just a fact about preserving this structure, right, from man-made catastrophes essentially. And of course, you can see the groin vaults, they're ribbed, right? And then again, you have that blue color related to the heavens, but also related to France, right? The blue color of France and the fleur de lis, right, as well, very symbolic. So this is amazing little chapel here in the later Gothic. I wanted to show you just a bit of sculpture to finish up our discussion of the medieval and Gothic and kind of ease us into our last discussion, the Proto-Renaissance. I show you the Castle of Love because I wanted to show you something that showed you pop culture. I had mentioned that flowers were like a big deal pop culturally to these people. They showed up in their literature, their poetry, right? Rose windows. And here on this little, what we call a jewelry casket, this would have been used to store a lady's jewelry. So it's like a jewelry box, but they would have called it a jewelry casket. It's made out of ivory. And you have the iron caning on the top and the handle, of course. On here, you actually see some imagery related to what we call the name of the rose, or different stories from the time that were sort of pop culture that dealt with knights and lords and ladies and how they would woo each other and the jousting and the different favors that would be extended. And so on the piece, you can notice in the middle, there's these two knights jousting while these ladies look on. And then you have kind of the idea of Cupid with their arrows, right, on the left hand side, throwing roses up and over the parapets and down, and then on the right hand side you have a lady giving roses to the knight, kind of saying, "Oh my love," right, "Oh my hero." So again, this shows you the pop culture of the time, this idea of the chivalry and the knights and the lords and the ladies and the monarchs and the flowers, and Just kind of sometimes I like to give you a sense of like what actual people owned, rather than just showing you, what the masses use. I like showing you kind of individual personal objects. So this is a great one for that. And then the final image I'll show you is the Virgin of Paris. This is a sculpture that is today in Notre Dame and did survive the fire as well. So people were very excited about that because it's a very important sculpture. And why do I show you the Virgin of Paris? She's the Virgin Mary, of course, right? She's the Theotokos, right? She's the Queen of Heaven. But if you really know your art history, you should be going, she seems familiar. The way she stands, the way she's holding the Christ child. I'm having this echo back to something I've seen before. Go back and look at Hermes and Dionysus from the late classical, right? Praxiteles, go look at that. And you'll notice the stance, the way that she holds the Christ child, everything sort of mimics that. And so I would say you're starting to see the Renaissance come into play now. You're starting to see contrapposto and these techniques from the classical world resurge. And again, we're going to look finally at the Proto Renaissance and conclude our discussion there. So this is a little bit of a preview of that.